Today's edition is a special one. It's about decolonizing pride because it's Pride Month. And as I posted a bit earlier today, that for queer Ukrainians, if you really want to honor all those tens of thousands of queer Ukrainians who are now fighting on the front line against fascism, risking their lives, sacrificing their lives, the only appropriate way to honor them on this Pride Month would be to arm Ukraine and to amplify that call as much as possible. And that's what we're going to do this time around as well, explaining Ukrainian pride, both national and any other kind of prides Ukrainians carry inside these days, but also explaining why honoring that pride through arming Ukraine is the only way to go. Okay, so before I introduce our today's guest, I wanted to share with you, everyone, especially those who joined our spaces for the first time, who we are, what we're doing here. Ukrainian Spaces were launched by me and Valeria almost 3 months ago because we saw so many of Ukrainians with perfect English sharing their stories across all social media platforms. Yet the conversations about Ukraine still to this day dominated by Western, mostly white and mostly male folks. And not only it continuously robs Ukrainians of their agency, but it also perpetuates outdated, misleading, and false narratives about Ukraine and Ukrainians. So we want to foster a relaxed, safe, and chill space for Ukrainian voices to express themselves without the need of fitting any Western boxes. And the rest of you can use the space to educate yourself and maybe decolonize some of your views of Ukrainians. And Ukrainian Spaces is a live broadcast event on Twitter Spaces, but it's been automatically recorded and uploaded as podcasts on Apple and Spotify. Please, check all the episodes. We uploaded over a dozen by now there. But most importantly, it's not only to subscribe to those podcasts, but also rate them and comment on them, because that's how we actually become trending on those platforms. Thank you so much for all the comments that we're already receiving. It's just so inspiring and uplifting. All my love goes to our subscribers, but a special love goes to our Patreon sponsors, because Ukrainian Spaces is 100% independent, volunteer and listener supported effort. And our Patreon space is called Ukrainian Spaces, and we have terrific sponsors there who are not just, not doing just charity, but receiving a lot of extra bonus stuff, but most importantly, get front seat if they want to ask questions in person or in Patreon space. So I see some of our sponsors and Patreon friends and family already here. So if you guys want to ask any of the questions during the live broadcast, you just request the mic. I see you. Okay, so now we proceed to our featured Ukrainian. Maria, you're with us right now.
Hi.
Hi, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Sorry, I'm keep telling you with us and we, although today I'm all by myself without Valeria. But thank you so much for joining us again. You're our part of our Ukrainian Spaces family. We're super glad but of course but I'm super glad to see you here again. And following our favorite rule, we never introduce our featured Ukrainians. And although you already did it once, please introduce yourself to everyone else, who you are, what you've been doing, and how your life since the genocide has been.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maksym, for having me. And a big thank you to all of the listeners who are here with us today. I really appreciate everyone showing up and being interested in this topic and in Ukrainian voices, Ukrainian spaces. So my name is Maria. Originally, I am from Kyiv, but I've been living in Canada for quite some time. I've been working in the nonprofit sector for the last 7 years, and I used to run an Instagram account for embroidery. I used to do different embroidery tutorials, and it was just a little account for fun and to share embroidery techniques. And as of February 25th, after the war broke out, I did a pivot and switched content entirely to advocate for Ukraine and share history lessons, cultural lessons, and just acquaint an audience, which was primarily at the time Western Canadians and Americans wanting to learn embroidery, acquaint that audience with the sociocultural and political history and present of Ukraine. And also, of course, to gain traction for folks being invested in the war and helping us support win the war.
Yeah, and just to add, because I'm a huge stan, Maria has quickly became indispensable voice when it comes to educating foreigners, especially amassing very huge audience on Instagram, where you do this fantastic educational, super digestible, simple work of educating people about Ukraine, the genocide, the Russian invasion, but also doing extra work and tackling topics of Russian colonialism and the context around what we're going through. But so again, thank you so much for that. But I've been saying you thanks for many months now. But one of the posts that you did some time ago, and this is a topic we are both super passionate about, is amplifying the stories of queer Ukrainians on the front line. And Ukraine has hundreds of openly queer soldiers, people who serve in territorial defense, but also openly queer people who are helping out on other front lines, humanitarian and informational ones. And you did this fantastic post about Artur, who is one of our openly queer soldiers, who is also a drag queen in previous life, the pre-war life. Can you tell him more about that? How you came about his story, and what was like to connect with him at this moment, and sharing his story with your audience?
Absolutely. Excuse me. Absolutely. Yeah. So I've done two posts on two different queer soldiers. So this one that you're referring to on Artur, who is now with the Ukrainian Armed Forces. And before February 24th, he was a drag queen and a beekeeper. And another post on a bisexual man named Ilya, who before the war was a marathon runner and worked in IT. And now he's on the front lines as well. So both of them I came across in my Explore feed on Instagram, and they were either profiled by or shared by the account LGBTQI Military, which is an Instagram account that profiles queer Ukrainian armed forces members or volunteers. And so I sent him a message and I said, hi, introduced myself and explained that I'm also queer, that I'm gay and Ukrainian. And I really want to highlight the stories and experiences of queer armed forces members or volunteers, because I think it's really important to destigmatize the idea or the notion that Ukraine is somehow homophobic, more so than the West. I mean, homophobia exists in every culture, in every country. There's homophobia in Canada. I've been gay bashed in major cities in Canada, in Calgary and in Ottawa, you know, so we can't say that homophobia doesn't exist anywhere. But this idea that somehow Ukraine is more homophobic than the West, I really wanted to destigmatize that notion and bring attention to openly queer people who are proud. And so I found Ilya and Artur, and they were both very, very gracious with their time, and they welcomed the idea. So I did a sort of a mini interview that I could fit into a 10 slide deck with just 4 questions. And essentially, the questions focused on what their lives were like before the war, what they're like now, and any sort of issues potentially that have come up in relation to their sexuality, if there are any. Both, just as a spoiler alert, both said that there have been none. And then what they hope to see in a free Ukraine. And I thought it was really, really important, to highlight queer Ukrainians, especially those who are currently fighting and volunteering, because um, oftentimes Ukraine gets lumped in with our neighbors in relation to treatment of LGBTQ people. Poland, who have been wonderful to us and are a great neighbor, but unfortunately, Polish laws and policies are not welcoming to LGBTQ people. They're not inclusive. And of course, then looking at Russia, who it even like pains me to call a neighbor, but their laws are so archaic and so discriminatory that unfortunately, for a lot of people, particularly in the West, Ukraine and Russia get lumped in as one. And I'm sure that the folks listening here today are familiar with the term brotherly nations. And so, unfortunately, I think that a lot of the negativity that is rightfully associated with Russia when it comes to queer issues in public opinion or in public imagination also just gets transposed onto Ukrainians as well. So I thought it was very, very important to highlight that distinction that Ukraine is nothing like Russia, especially when it comes to LGBTQ people.
Unfortunately, this is one of the most favorite questions you're asked as a public queer Ukrainian all the time by foreign journalists or foreigners. Like, it's always has something about Russia in it. Like, how's the situation is different than in Russia? Or are you afraid if Russia occupies Ukraine? And it's always been present there. And I think it's a part of an important job that you're trying to also to do to decolonize that views that Ukrainian queerness has nothing to do in Russia. Moreover, probably all our problems with homophobia. This is the only way where Russia steps in, and Russian colonial legacy has direct link to it. But you know, I know that you also passionate about the stories of queer Ukrainians these days because you're queer, but also because I feel like we have a lot to tell about why we're resisting, and that this fight is not so much about territory or politics or geopolitics, but more about values. So, would you agree with that? I mean, how do you always feel as a queer person looking at this tragedy that our country is going through, and why you think queer Ukrainians are so passionately on the front lines, risking everything for our own equality and freedom?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that statement. And I think that's another misconception that arises a lot for Western listeners or Western viewers who really do view this simply as a question of territory and land. And hence why Western leaders have raised this notion of, well, why don't you just cede the land? It's just land. But the thing is, it's not just land. Ukrainian identity is so deeply tied to our homeland. Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian ways of being, everything that makes us Ukrainian is so interwound with Ukraine. And so it's impossible to just give away the land. It's not just land. It represents and it is symbolic of who we are as a people. And so I really wish for folks who are non-Ukrainian to understand that and to understand how incredibly offensive and overgeneralized and simplistic it is to say, well, why don't you just give the land away? Because it's not just land, it's part of who we are. And I think I'm speaking from Canada, and there's strong parallels with Indigenous communities in Canada for whom the land is incredibly important. It's a part of who they are as First Nations and as people, and we have that same connection to our land. And so being queer and being Ukrainian are two things that you simply cannot divorce from your identity. They are interwound with who you are as a person. And so I think for a lot of queer Ukrainians, it's especially close to home. It's especially important because for us, we have had to hide who we are for so many years of our lives. For many people who are still closeted and are still hiding for whatever reasons, people have their own paths and trajectories. But for so many queer people, we have had to hide who we are for so much of our life. And we're not hiding the Ukrainianness, you know. and
Yeah.
and then again, also like having lived in the West for many years, at first I did. I hid the fact that I was gay, and I also would try and hide or kind of avert the conversation to avoid talking about that I was Ukrainian, because oftentimes when you would say that you are, um, just the look on people's faces would change, and you could see that 30 seconds ago they thought you were articulate and educated and accomplished, and you would say that you're Ukrainian, and all of a sudden there's just a flicker in the eye and they think, oh, Eastern Europe, oh, cement
Mm.
blocks, oh, Chernobyl, oh, poverty. So for many years, you know, I hid or tried to hide sort of both integral aspects of who I am as a person.
This is extremely powerful, and then I know you also mentioned it a bit earlier, and also in our conversations, and I told you as well that personally for me to come out as queer person was fucking easier than to accept my Ukrainianness and also
Mhm.
come out as a Ukrainian, as a proud Ukrainian. I did the queer thing when I was my early 20s, and I did the Ukrainian thing only in my early 30s, just exactly for the same shame that I wouldn't even necessarily clock as a conditional since I was a kid. That, I don't want to come across as a Ukrainian because people think that I'm uneducated, or if I speak Ukrainian, I come from uneducated farms or villages or something like that. And I remember we shared this story, and I told you that for many years, up until like quite recently, I would just instinctively hide my passport at border controls because I didn't want for people to clock that I'm Ukrainian, or not even intentionally. And only
Mhm.
now I
Mhm.
realize what a fucked up thing it was, and how we were conditioned to hate our Ukrainian roots so much through generations that even in such a random situations is just pops. And this is very disturbing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recall my mom doing the exact same thing. Like I can recall being at airports with her and her having her Ukrainian passport ready and, you know, holding it in her hand, preparing for the flight. And she would hide the cover, like she would cover it with her purse or with her sleeve so that, you know, the Germans in the Frankfurt airport wouldn't be looking around and thinking, oh, there goes another poor Ukrainian, or, oh, she must be a maid, or she, you know. So it runs very deeply. There was a lot of shame, for both components of that, of my identity for many years. And yeah.
It's so similar to the way we feel about our Ukrainian roots. And I think in these examples, and especially in examples of now Pride, so-called Pride Brigade fighting on the Ukrainian front lines, this is where you understand that this is more than a territorial issue. This is a civilizational war in the middle of Europe, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think to answer your question about why, how they're similar or what the similarities are, I would say it's because both Ukrainian identity and queer identity have been so stigmatized by the outside world for so long. I mean, I would go so far as to say for generations that they've been stigmatized by, particularly by the West. And you know, for queer identity, there's so many negative stereotypes that come along with lesbians and gay and trans people. For Ukrainians, there's again so many horrific stereotypes that come along with that. When you share that you're Ukrainian, people, again, they think that you're poor, uneducated. if you're a woman, and especially if you're an attractive passing woman, that you're a mail order bride, or that you're a sex worker, or that you've been trafficked, or that you're an alcoholic, or that people in your family are alcoholics, or that you're a gold digger, all of those stereotypes. There's so much stigma and shame ascribed onto both of these identities in different ways, but particularly by the West, that you internalize it in a lot of ways. And I think that we're really at a turning point in history. With queer identity, I think that turning point, we've maybe sort of passed the peak, and we're more in an era of acceptance. And that's not to say that we don't have to keep fighting for acceptance and fighting for progress, especially in certain regions of the world. But we're really at a turning point in history for Ukraine that I would say began with the revolution of dignity, where Ukrainians simply would not even consider being under the thumb of Russia anymore, or being associated with Russia or conflated with Russia. And this steam, this buildup, it's been building up since 2014, and we're really at an apex where Ukrainians are proud, and we are proud very fiercely, very, very openly, very visibly. And I think really one of the strengths of Ukraine in this war right now is the digital front and the virtual world, and all of the Ukrainians who are so visible on platforms like Instagram and Twitter. Because this allows an international audience to see an authentic Ukrainian people, and we're all different, right? There's no singular Ukrainian person. We're all very different and diverse, in so many ways, with religions, with language, with queerness. There's no single Ukrainian, and so I think it's so important that through the information war, through these digital fronts, people can see the diversity in Ukrainians, and they can see all of the reasons that we're proud, all of the things that we're fighting for, and they can start to maybe piece together and understand that Ukrainianness and queerness are both integral parts to identity. You have to fight for them. You have to be proud of them, because otherwise you are. It's like cutting off a limb. You're abandoning a part of who you are, right? Or you're living a double life or a ghost life. You're not fully living as your authentic self. And I think people are starting to piece that together.
Yeah, because Ukrainian identity is first and foremost about freedom. I think this is something that all our guests and featured Ukrainians all the time mention, that being Ukrainian for them, something always revolves about freedom and fighting for freedom and standing up for freedom. And for me personally, this is an integral part of my queer identity. I think it was shaped up by these desire to be free and desire to be treated as equal human being. And now I'm also pinning to our conversation some of the tweets, this powerful manifesto that our Kharkiv Pride family published on the day of fight against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia on May 17th. And they specifically mentioned this very cool part about Russian colonialism and roots of homophobia in Russian colonialism. They say, here's a quote, "We call to reject homo, bi, transphobia as colonial thinking that was brought upon Ukrainian people by the Russian ideology, but has actually never been inherent to the Ukrainian culture and statehood." And I think there is a lot of stuff that is still educational stuff that is still missing to educate outside folks on those roots between Russian colonial rule and how homophobia became entrenched. Is it something interesting maybe you came across in your work or in your attempts to educate people on this specific topic, or maybe something from your life that kind of helped you to realize the same fact of these links between colonial past, well, present of Ukraine and homophobia as well?
Yeah, I actually have a personal anecdote to speak to kind of relate to that. So, my stepmom, my mom passed away when I was a kid, when I was 13. She passed away from cancer, and so my stepmom has raised me ever since. And her and I are very, very close. She is absolutely like a second mother to me, and um, we just have a very deep love and respect for each other, a very close relationship. And she is a very, very big supporter of the LGBTQ community. She's a very big ally. She's a Ukrainian woman who has never lived outside of Ukraine. Um, she's vacationed in like Turkey and Thailand, but she's never lived anywhere outside of Ukraine. So she's a Ukrainian woman, and she's in her 50s. She's 56. She's, on the cusp of the boomer generation and the Gen X generation, I guess. So, and again, like people would expect someone of that demographic to be homophobic, to be close to the idea of LGBTQ acceptance and tolerance. And she's not at all. She's an incredible ally. And we had a conversation one time where she was talking about how it's incredibly important to value every single person and every single person's identity and individualism, and to respect people's queerness. And she was saying, and she made a comment, and she said, um, before the Soviet Union, I don't know if there really was homophobia in Ukraine. Not to the extent that it is now, because it's through the Soviet occupation that really everything relating to sex was made very, very taboo. She was saying that, under the Soviet Union, you couldn't discuss sex as pleasure. That wasn't a conversation that you could have or that was acceptable in those years. And so she just spoke as someone who had grown up and lived, a significant portion of her life under the Soviet Union rule, and as someone who has now lived in a free Ukraine. And she was saying that for her, the ideas of homophobia and transphobia are very distinctly tied to Soviet occupation. That's not something that I've researched or formally looked into or can comment from like an academic perspective, but just as a
Yeah.
personal anecdote from someone who is a Ukrainian who's lived in both worlds, at this point, probably an equal amount of years. For me, it was really interesting to hear that comment. And
Yeah.
just to see the progress that's come since Ukraine has been independent, because I don't think this is a conversation that could even have been thought of under the Soviet Union. And now to
Oh,
have,
no.
parents of queer children, of queer youth, of queer people, of queer adults who are fully on board, fully accepting. I mean, I think that would blow some people in the West mind. Like, I don't think that people can even conceptualize that there are Ukrainian parents who fully support their queer children.
Oh yeah, and together when we had before the war, before pandemic, when we had pride marches, not only in Kiev but in other cities, the groups of parents of queer kids are always present there. And in terms of civil society and queer civil society in Ukraine, those are the most badass active groups and organizations out there. And the people in their 50s and 60s who basically were shaped by Soviet Union and Soviet identity are now turn out to be one of the most vocal and fearless advocates for equality and queer equality in Ukraine. It's always so moving for me, and thank you so much for sharing the story, because I really resonated with it as well, through the people I know, through my own parents that were also raised and were shaped by the Soviet rule. And now, I mean, of course, in recent years, it's been interesting to see how their views of equality are changing, of course, because of me and because of what I share with them and how I explain to them, how it's important, how it works, but also how they do this mental mapping of things that were taboo and still are taboo in Russia, which is a proud uh, um, how do you call it, a proud successor of Soviet legacy and Soviet Union, and how the things are inside Ukraine. And almost see this instant logical conclusion for them and for many people. And they're like, okay, so if it's so in homophobia and criminalizing of queer identity is so celebrated and was celebrated in Soviet Russia and is celebrated in Russia, this is probably something that shouldn't be the case in Ukraine, just by the fact that Russians are so obsessed with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's actually kind of leads me to this question of, again, overlapping our queer identities and our national identities, because one of the most, I mean, of course, there's a bot activity and people just gaslighting you, especially when you share something about our Pride Brigade and Ukrainians on the front lines. But there are also honest questions about whether this is some kind of a pinkwashing happening. When we kind of present our queer fighters and people on the queer front lines as something to justify the support for Ukraine. And have you faced anything like that? People honestly asking you about whether us promoting and us sharing the stories about queer fighters and queer soldiers is pinkwashing in any way?
So I personally haven't gotten any commentary like that. I'd say for the most part, I have a really great audience. I have an audience of people who are very understanding, and um, just overall are pretty phenomenal. Of course, I get trolls and bots, and I get message requests from people with all kinds of terrible, terrible commentary. But for the most part, I haven't really gotten anything on this topic. But I have sort of seen commentary and posts floating around on some pages that I used to follow for things like intersectional feminism. And so I've seen some commentary along the lines of, oh, well, these Ukrainian queers are just being exploited to create or falsify an image of Ukraine as a paradise, as a gay paradise, as a country that has no issues, or these Ukrainian soldiers are just being exploited for clout to resist the image of Azov and to sort of falsely counter the idea that Ukraine is a Nazi, but Ukrainians are all Nazis. They're just picking and choosing, two queer soldiers to counter that idea or that narrative. And so I've seen those floating around in comments, and both of those are so false and so dishonest and so just outright lies. Because first of all, I mean, on the topic of Azov, we could talk about that for ages. The only thing that I'll say today is that they are absolutely not a neo-Nazi unit. They're part of the National Guard. They're absorbed into Ukraine overall. The members of Azov are picked from a national pool of contenders who are exceptionally skilled. And I mean, that's all I'll say in relation to Azov. But the idea that somehow we are using queer people to create this image of Ukraine as a paradise, I mean, that's false. We know that there is work to be done internally, and there are people doing that work. That's why we have organizations like Kyiv Pride. That's why we have Kharkiv Pride. That's why we have activists. We have people doing this work. We acknowledge and recognize that there are still internal domestic policies that need to change. But if folks haven't read the post that I did with Artur, I really do encourage everyone to read through that, because he says that Ukrainian public opinion, the collective imagination of Ukrainians in Ukraine, is changing at light speed. The way that the average Ukrainian perceives queer people now, perceives queer Ukrainians, is changing so drastically in such a short, condensed period of time. Just in the last 5 years, how much acceptance has grown. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that we did have our revolution of dignity, that Ukrainians are very, very dramatically aligned with European values, that we are very streamlined towards democracy and progressive values, and that includes LGBTQ rights. So for people who think that we are, platforming queer Ukrainians to create a false image, I'd say to that you haven't been to Ukraine, you haven't spoken to a Ukrainian, you don't know Ukrainians. Like, get to know us first, visit our country, follow our creators and activists and journalists to get a truer understanding of Ukrainian values and what we stand for. And you'll understand that we are so starkly different from,
Yeah.
Russia, and very, very closely aligned to Western Europe and the Western world in general. And I would say that Ukraine is absolutely a leader in this sense, and especially a leader and a hub in Eastern Europe. I think Kyiv Pride has done such an incredible job at amplifying and highlighting and doing that really important work. The last time I marched with Kyiv Pride was 2016, and just seeing everything that they've done on social media in these last 6 years, I am incredibly proud of them, of my city, of regular Ukrainians in Kyiv. I'm so proud of the work that has been done and the shifts that I'm seeing. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's really moving and so nice to hear and about my Kiev Pride family. And I totally, not because I'm part of it, but I totally agree that it still serves. And if there are people who are listening here from the region, they know that Kiev Pride and just in general, Ukrainian queer activists serve as such a huge inspiration for anyone in the region, from Georgia, from Moldova to Poland now, unfortunately, and Hungary, where the situation got worse. But I've just seen today a recent polling that was done just some weeks ago, already during the genocide, and it included the question on acceptance of LGBTQ people. And for the first time in Ukrainian history, two-thirds of the people either have positive or neutral attitude towards queerness and LGBT people. And it kind of course, it's a wartime, and polling wartime is a bit tricky, but it's a powerful indication that you're absolutely right, that it has been a tremendous change in terms of attitudes before the genocide, but now during the genocide, and with so many people seeing how queer people are openly the first ones, among the first ones on the front line defending our country, I really hope that it also delivers this powerful change in terms of acceptance that we were working so hard in the last decade. Hopefully it will stick around. I mean, not hopefully, we'll work hard for
It
it to
will. It
stick.
will stick around.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
absolutely.
that poll, that doesn't surprise me, and it wouldn't surprise me if that figure was actually on the low end of the actual numbers. Again, to emphasize, I'm openly gay. I have a wife. Every single person in my personal circle, in my personal life in Ukraine is fully accepting, from my parents to my best friend to my other friends. I've not had a single person in my life not be accepting or be hostile or even be hesitant. Like, it's normal oftentimes for people to maybe be unsure if it's something that's new to them or unfamiliar. Hesitancy can be a normal reaction, and then people come around. I haven't even personally, again, like, I'm not speaking for all queer Ukrainians, and again, like, I'm from a major city, but I personally have not experienced any kind of hostility or reluctance or hesitancy. I've had nothing but open minds and open arms and love and like full acceptance. And for me, that is really motivating, because I know that I'm not the only one. I know that many other people have had similar experiences, and I want to share that because I really want to counter again this idea or this narrative or this perception that Ukrainians are homophobic, that we're a backwards country, that we don't have European values, that we're very, very traditionalist. And of course, there are traditionalist people. Of course, there are conservatives, but every thriving, healthy democracy has conservatives and traditionalists.
Yeah,
That's a part of a democracy. You look at Canada
yeah,
or America or the UK, the same demographics exist, but the main thing is that the majority either accept or are neutral towards, and they think that's a huge advance. Again, something that's happened within the last 5 years, and they think this very salient visual representation of queer people, queer soldiers on the front lines is really helping to push that openness. And to speak to that, to speak to how far Ukraine has come just in the recent years. I mean, Ukraine's official Instagram account with millions of followers shared and profiled a Ukrainian soldier, and the photo that they chose to use wasn't him in uniform, wasn't him on the front lines. It was a photo of him wearing really like high heel, platform high heels, and
Yeah.
posing
Yeah.
in like a pretty seductive pose, you know? So, and of course there were negative comments under that post. There were trolls and there were people who didn't agree. But the fact that an official Ukrainian account that represents the country on the digital front would choose to highlight a queer Ukrainian soldier and to use a provocative photo, I think really illustrates where we are currently as a country and where we are headed as a country.
Yeah.
And I personally couldn't be more proud.
Sure. I mean, not to sugarcoat it, because as a person who's been openly queer at early times when it was actually dangerous, for your physical safety. Of course, I faced some violence and from radical groups and death threats, and it's not to say that the life is has been and was completely rosy, of course not. But at the same time, people are always really find it bizarre to find out that the same people who would be on the opposing side during Pride, protesting against it and participating for it, that several months later can join together side by side at a protest against corruption or against police brutalities, which has happened many times in recent years. Far right, these muscle far right guys coming to protest against police brutality, and people with rainbow flags joining them, and they just do that job because it's important for the country, despite that they have very extremely opposing views on LGBTQ issues. And this is something, actually, maybe I'll ask you this version of this question about Ukrainian identity, because we'll have to wrap it up. But I know that you already in previous episode answered it about what it means to be Ukrainian for you. But in this version, looking at these similarities, how people can overcome their identity issues for the sake of Ukraine, whether it was in peaceful times joining for protest as a civil society, or now, serving in the same units or helping for a humanitarian cause. Why do you think it's so easy for Ukrainians to overcome these divisions, and maybe why such a thing as queer identity and Ukrainian identity, national identity, are so easy to align, which is something that almost never happens in many other countries these days, unfortunately.
Yes, that's a great question. I would love to speak on that. And you're right. In many countries, queer identity is often seen as mutually exclusive to national pride. There's this perception that gay, lesbian, bi, trans identity somehow rejects cultural identity and pride, because cultural and national pride is often predicated on more traditional values like family, in particular, nuclear family, religion, and those are all things that typically, queer identity sort of is at odds with. So people have a really difficult time reconciling the two. And we could say that before the war and in previous years, that this same sort of division existed within Ukraine and perhaps still exists to a much lesser extent today. But what I think happened and what I think the war has really highlighted for the average person is that queer identity and Ukrainian pride are absolutely not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're very, very deeply intertwined. And I think the average Ukrainian, not even in a malicious sense of particularly negative stereotypes of queer people, but even more sort of reserved ideas about queer people that gay men don't fight, gay men don't enlist, gay men don't protect. These sort of ideas kind of float throughout public consciousness, even though they're untrue. But for a long time, they were unchallenged, and so they maintained this belief, this power. But now people are seeing the amount of queer Ukrainians enlisted, the amount of queer Ukrainians fighting and protecting our homeland. And this is causing shifts in public opinion. People are noticing and seeing and thinking, I'm presented with new evidence, so maybe I need to reassess my belief system, because before, perhaps I had this outdated belief that queer people, in particular gay and bi men, don't enlist, don't fight, don't protect, don't defend. But now I'm seeing a complete opposite truth. I'm seeing evidence that counters this belief. I'm seeing that actually there are drag queens, fighting for us and fighting for this country. And it becomes more of a holistic marriage of identities where people understand that queer Ukrainians are Ukrainians. Queer Ukrainians are proud Ukrainians, and that we will fight for our country in any means necessary, whether that's on the digital front in the information war, whether that's on the actual front in the real war. And I think this is really starting to get through to people, again, through the gift of social media. Ukraine is a very, very tech-heavy, tech-developed, tech-savvy country. And I think this is really getting through to a significant amount of people. And folks are starting to understand that we are fighting for Ukrainian identity. We're fighting for Ukrainian pride, Ukrainian future, the Ukrainian right to exist. And queer Ukrainians really, truly understand this on such an intimate level, because we have already had to fight these battles. We've already had to fight for the right to exist wherever we are, whether we're in
Amen.
Ukraine or we're in Canada or wherever we are. We've had to fight to exist, to be recognized, to be acknowledged. We've had to fight for pride. And this is what all of Ukraine is doing right now. So they're very intimately intertwined. And I think the average person is starting to really get a lot of clarity on this.
God, this is like a true therapy. I cannot imagine a better person to share the first day of this Pride Month
Oh,
than
thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Дякую тобі дуже. This is always an honor, and we're honored, and I'm beyond honored that you're also part of Ukrainian Spaces family. But for folks who want to follow your work, well, first of all, check VinokCollective on Instagram, which where you post the majority of your work. But maybe there's something else you would like to amplify, especially today, in terms of where people can go and either donate or learn more, not only about queer Ukrainians, but about Ukraine in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say if you don't already follow, you absolutely must follow the pages both on Twitter and on Instagram for Kyiv Pride and for Kharkiv Pride. Please, they do incredible, very, very important work. Also, LGBTQI Military is an Instagram page that finds and profiles and highlights queer Ukrainian soldiers and volunteers who are currently fighting in Ukraine. They share some personal stories with photos, and it just helps to give, I think, a bit more of a personal understanding to the people who are involved. And so they're a wonderful account to follow. Andrew Kushnir, he's a Ukrainian living in Canada. He's been doing a lot of work and a lot of fundraising for I believe, 6 different Ukrainian LGBTQ nonprofits. So he's a really powerful voice. Of course, Maksym, who is our wonderful host and leader. If you don't already follow him, absolutely necessary, although I suppose that you do because you're all here today. And otherwise, in terms of who to donate to and how to support, I would say the number one place and organization to donate is our armed forces. I know that a lot of people, again, particularly in the West, will perhaps reject this, or they'll say, "Oh, I don't want to support the military industrial complex." No, this is not a military industrial complex. In 30 years, Ukraine has never waged a war on anybody. We are simply defending ourselves from invasion, from genocide, from imperialism. We are defending ourselves, and defense is not a military industrial complex. It is the right to exist. It's a human right to exist. And the army, the Ukraine armed forces, are fighting for every single Ukrainian, and this includes queer and gay Ukrainians. So please, the number one source you can donate to and give your money to is the armed forces, because without the armed forces, there's no Ukraine, there's no more pride, there's no more gays, there's no more trans people, there's none of us. We all, in the unfathomable, unspeakable event that Ukraine was to be occupied, there would be none of this. We simply could not exist as queer Ukrainians. And I cannot emphasize and stress enough, as a lesbian, as a queer person, as a gay Ukrainian living in liberal Canada, please donate to the Ukrainian armed forces. It's the best thing you can do. Weapons first, defense first, everything later.
During this Pride Month, the only right way to honor queer Ukrainians dying and sacrificing their lives on the front line with fascism is calling for, amplifying, and supporting Army in Ukraine, period. This is so important.
So
Thank
important.
You so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I wanted to close it by, I just saw this tweet by other part of a member of our Ukrainian Spaces family, Tatiana Danforth, Tatiana Bisek on Twitter, and she says, how about instead of saying, wow, Ukrainians are so resilient, maybe tell us, wow, you guys need so much help, what can I do? And this is exactly what we need you guys to do. If you cannot donate yourself, please amplify those calls right away. For everyone else, please claim Ukrainian Spaces hashtag on Twitter or elsewhere. We love when you share your feedback about our podcasts and show and suggest us topics to decolonize and Ukrainians to feature. But especially if you're Ukrainian, I so encourage you to claim this hashtag and share your experiences as a Ukrainian, what you want to share with the rest of the world. We always amplify those messages on our shows. And for everyone else, just stick around, listen to podcasts, comment them, rate them, absolutely. Марія, дякую тобі дуже, слава Україні.
Героям слава, дуже дякую, Maksym, and happy Pride Month, everyone. Remember that queer Ukrainians exist. We're proud Ukrainians, and we are fighting for Ukraine.